further ado, I am absolutely delighted to welcome two of our favorites here tonight. We are so happy to have Flynn Barry here. Flynn Barry is the New York Times best-selling author of 3 novels, Northern Spy, out in paperback today, a Reese's Book Club pick, A Double Life, which we have in the front room there. It was a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, and Under the Harrow, which won the Edgar Award for Best First Novel and was named a Best Book of the Year by the Washington Post and the Atlantic. The recipient of a Yaddo Fellowship, she is a graduate of Brown University and the Michener Center for Writers. She lives right here in Vermont, and we are delighted to be celebrating the release of the paperback of Northern Spy tonight. And joining Flynn at the very last minute, thank you again, we've got Katie Crouch. Katie Crouch is the New York Times best-selling author of Girls and Trucks, Men and Dogs, and Abroad. She's also written essays for the New York Times, for Glamour, The Guardian, Slate, Salon, Tin House, and others. A former resident of Namibia, the subject of Embassy Wife, and San Francisco. Crouch now lives in Vermont and teaches creative writing at Dartmouth College. Please, all of you, join me in giving a warm Norwich Bookstore welcome to Katie Crouch and Flynn Barry.
What do you think? Can they hear us? Or should we? Can we go like this?
In the back.
Yay us, Flynn. Yay us. I'm going to say there is a special spot in hell for, and that spot, if you've ever done anything really bad, just think about the time when you will be in purgatory and someone like Sam will be saying, Jane Doe, you are the recipient of the Not Very Good Mother Award and the Always Late to Kindergarten Award and never gives your children healthy food award. It's very I find it
unrealistic.
Unreal when someone talks about you in the third person in front of yourself.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Norwich
But we are
Bookstore.
so lucky to have this amazing bookstore right here in our little town, and so lucky to have Flynn Barry, who moved here just recently, guys, and she contacted me and said, I'm an author, and I was like, oh, she's an author, okay, so let's have, and then I did it. I have a 5-year-old, and it just took me a couple of minutes. And then I Googled it, I'm like, wait a minute, hold on. This is one of my favorite authors, holy. So I was so excited. And so this is a wonderful book, Northern Spy. Also, Under the Harrow is one of my just top favorite books. I just love that book. It's really, 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 really dark. So, so Flynn, I just want to open up. So murder, sisterly betrayal, spying, NRA, more murder. What's up with these beach reads?
Yeah, I mean, is that not what everyone else thinks about all the time? I think crime writing is wonderful because you can fit so much into it. You have kind of your constraints, you have your kind of Trojan horse of the mystery that's being solved, and then you get to just really dive into whatever you're obsessed with. So the sister relationship or Ireland, and you can kind of pack a lot into that Trojan horse of a crime story. I also think, I heard recently that your amygdala, the part of your brain that controls fear, grows when you're pregnant and just never shrinks back down. And that certainly happened for me. And it just felt like my mind is constantly playing through sort of what-if scenarios or the worst-case scenarios as a kind of protective measure as a parent. And so it felt, especially with this novel, having a newborn and being kind of sleepless and in that really odd state, it felt really easy to imagine like seeing flashlights outside the house moving and how scared you would feel alone at night with a baby. I think that vulnerability is very easy to access when you have a tiny child, but it's also something I'm just curious about. I think also we talked about this at your class, but there's a level of fear that women sort of function with all the time. Like I was talking to my friend Zane and asked her if she would go for a jog in Norwich at 10 p.m. and she said probably not. And it's just interesting that there's that kind of like curfew that we all live under without even thinking twice about it. And so writing crime fiction has been a way for me to sort of work out and have some catharsis with the fact that we have that kind of ongoing monologue or like ticker running.
Well, let's step back and talk about Northern Spy in specific. So, can you give, if those of perhaps not everyone here has read it yet because they're here curious, what just sort of the elevator pitch?
Sure. So Northern Spy is about two sisters, Tessa and Marion, and they live in a near future Belfast. Sort of the pod history of Northern Ireland is that Ireland was all an English colony, and then about 100 years ago, Northern Ireland was divided by a partition. So the Republic is independent and free. Northern Ireland is still a colony and still part of the United Kingdom. And so you have this really odd situation where you have an island of 500 people with a hard border across it and completely different laws on either side. And so the book is about what happens a couple years from now, maybe, if the IRA does continue how much it is currently ramping up. In 2016, when Brexit happened, they started recruiting a lot more heavily and drawing attention to their cause. And I think it's really interesting. It's an interesting situation there now because we've had about 20 years since the peace agreement, when the Troubles ended, but things haven't totally improved. You have this kind of post-conflict society that's still in conflict, where anyone who's been to Belfast, you see these peace walls dividing Protestant and Catholic communities. Most kids go to segregated schools, so they're only in school with Catholic or Protestant students. And you have, I think it's 10,000 members of loyalist paramilitaries at the moment. And so it's kind of, that's the horrible elevator pitch because it's not one sentence.
No, it's a good one, isn't it?
But yeah, I think it's interesting. It's interesting that we think that the Troubles are over, but there have been more people have died by suicide in Northern Ireland since the Troubles ended than died during the whole of the Troubles. So you have this, and the suicide rate is 3 times higher than England. So something's not working. Something hasn't kind of been healed or fixed with the conflict ending. And so that's why it's set a few years in the future.
And I think it's interesting too because I feel like the Troubles or that Northern Ireland has become more into the, well, just recently with the movie Belfast, which was kind of, a huge hit. And also, I mean, I grew up as, this is crazy, I know you're not going to believe this, but I'm part Irish.
Are you Irish?
And,
unbelievable.
And so we, heard a lot about it, but that really brought it back, sort of talk of my parents, and our Irish friends who have journeyed on. But it was really just like such a wash of the familiar, and I think probably spiked a lot of interest. And so that was one of my, can you go a little bit into more as to why not do a historical fiction? Why do something, which it does feel so relevant now with the whole unrest, right, in Europe right now. And so when you say that, I'm like, okay, so the nightmare is happening in Ukraine. Is it going to, tell a little bit why you decided, I'm going to base this in the future and not in the grounded past?
Yeah, I think it's also, it just felt more and more current the more research I did. It felt like this wasn't a war that had ended. And so it felt like setting it in the 70s or 80s would have been saying that this story's over, which it isn't. It's also, I really like our present moment. I think it's very interesting. I like reading fiction that's set right up against this moment. I just read a Roddy Doyle book of short stories set during the lockdown in Dublin. And there's something really satisfying about that kind of urgency you get when someone's using your own kind of daily texture, I think. It's also, a lot of what I was reading about the Troubles was really focused on the men who were involved in it, and I didn't feel like I had as much of a sort of in for it. It's also, maybe it would have been another level of difficulty. Like, you're already writing about somewhere different, and then also going back in time may have added another level of complication for me in researching. But the biggest thing was that it's all still this kind of tinderbox. And you have these kids who were born after the peace agreement, mostly boys, and they, in theory, have never known war or conflict in their community in Belfast, mostly. But then they haven't seen any of the benefits of peace. Like, they haven't gotten all of the investment in their community. They haven't gotten the money that's coming into Belfast from Game of Thrones filming there. And then they have these older men who are saying, when I was in my 20s, I was lying in a ditch watching a police station, and I was running guns with my friends, and we were having this like grand adventure, and we were going to be the generation to unite Ireland, and now you could be that generation. And so you have all these boys who are being offered nothing else except for that, and that's a very romantic and very compelling thing to be promising anyone. Like pure purpose, pure adrenaline, pure companionship. You have these people who will die for you, and you would die for them. And that's such an odd position to be in, where people think it's over, but then there are these boys being completely radicalized and getting really interested in like graveyards and IRA plots and marches and these things that you don't think of 12 and 13-year-olds being into. And then last spring there were a bunch of riots in Belfast, and some of the rioters were like 12 and 13-year-olds who were hijacking buses and setting them on fire. And there was a theory that at the time those riots were a cover for the loyalists preparing to go to war, and that the men who were really in charge were sending these kids out to sort of cause havoc, and that then they were getting their house in order and like appointing their generals and arming themselves while this was all happening as a distraction. And then Prince Philip died, and because they're monarchists, everything just stopped. So there's a sense that you're sort of teetering on this knife edge where if someone really loses it, you could have a civil war, or things could just keep at this kind of simmer. Which I think is really, and which feels a little bit like here. And like everywhere, like you're saying, like it feels like we're all kind of in this strange situation where you're like, at what point do you panic based on like the society you're in? Like, I think now we're panicking. Yeah. And I was just talking to someone, I don't know if they're in the audience, I won't embarrass them, but someone was like, oh yeah, like I bought iodine tablets just out of like a, you know, an anxiety shop. And it's like, yeah, that's, or someone else was like, okay, so if there is nuclear war, we'll drive to Maine, because that's better with the winds. Yeah, so we all have, like we're all having these kind of crazy like doomsday scenarios. And then I think Belfast is an interesting kind of case study of that. Like what could potentially happen or not.
And something I thought that was interesting about this book, and I think your next book, is the women in the NRA, which so you were just talking about the boys, but I would love to, of course, bring it back to what I want. I would love to hear about the women's roles in the NRA.
In the IRA, yeah, so the women in the IRA are very interesting. Their stories are hugely undertold. There's a book called Say Nothing that's really wonderful by Patrick Ryan Keefe. That's about one IRA fighter who's a woman in particular. But other than that, like the indexes of these books are just all male name after male name after male name. And it seems like the women were just not at all part of the conflict. But then as I was doing more research, I kept finding these stories where I was thinking, how is this not better known? Like there's this woman named Rose Dugdale who was a British debutante, an heiress, and she grew up in this kind of like Downton Abbey estate. And then she became a communist and joined the IRA, hijacked a helicopter, tried to bomb a police station, and stole a Vermeer and to ransom, which is extraordinary. Like she was responsible for the biggest art heist that had ever been done up until that time. And she was like a celebrity heiress from England.
I feel like Vermeers are always getting stolen.
They always get stolen. Yeah. They're stolen. Well, this same painting was stolen again from the same place. But and so that's just really interesting to me that you have, and she's still alive. She's in her 70s now. She lives outside Dublin. She works as a kind of like community organizer, nonprofit fundraiser, and has never apologized for what she did. She's not present anywhere except she has a Twitter account, and her icon is the Vermeer painting that she stole. So it's sort of this like interesting, like completely unapologetic. So she's really interesting. And then there are all these women whose names were never known, but were filling in the ranks when the IRA men went to prison. So there were teenage girls in the 70s who would take their platform heels and hollow them out and stuff them with explosive materials or messages or bullets and walk them through police checkpoints, and they wouldn't get stopped. And that happened over and over and over again. And it's just not our image. At one point, I read someone was saying that the most effective sniper in the Belfast IRA was a teenage girl, like a 17-year-old girl. And our image is very male. It's very much that the women were sort of at home with the children, and that's just not the case. And then there were also women who had children and joined the IRA after that because they felt like they wanted a better society for their kids, which I think is interesting because we think of motherhood often as sort of like discounting you from kind of like being in the fight, being active, being violent. And for these women, it was sort of a motivator that they had these kids and they weren't going to have them grow up the way they grew up. It's just and that those stories, like Rose Dugdale isn't known at all, and the other women, there are two sisters too who just haven't been sort of looked at because they just don't fit our idea of a terrorist. Even now, so this is, I could talk about this all night, but there was, I know, this is my single favorite topic. There was just a huge MI5 sting in Northern Ireland that rounded up a bunch of new IRA members, the leadership of the organization. And one of them is a woman who is a grandmother. And her lawyer was trying to get her bail and was saying she's a grandmother, she's a devoted grandmother, but she's also a terrorist who was masterminding, like, supplying the organization and getting it active and maybe bombing Limerick Airport. And those two things, those Venn diagrams, we can't really mesh, which means we're not really understanding the organization whatsoever or how to actually change the violent aspects of in some ways.
So interesting.
Yeah.
Well, and just as you talk about motherhood, I'm wondering, because you started talking about writing this book with the flashing lights because you were up all night with your children. I know I feel very hemmed in as a mother writing. Like the amount that I write has dwindled amazingly.
Yeah.
I would love to know about writing this book while you were a young mother and how you carve out time for yourself as a mother who writes.
Yeah. Katie has, I can't remember which book it is, but in one of Katie's books, the woman's a writer, and she and her husband have sort of blocks, and they're alternating them.
Oh, yeah.
And then the husband keeps kind of like stealing the blocks
her
because she
blocks.
hasn't like nursed, so she can't do it, and then she ends up with no blocks in the week. And I was like, the blocks, it's very hard. Yeah, it's really interesting. I think it's, I was trying to sort of think of it as a kind of like compression force, and that I would have less time to work, but that the time would still be valuable in some way because my mind was so like just completely cracked open that I was hoping that would be effective in some other ways. When Ronan was really little, I was nursing him, and he would fall asleep on my lap, and I would work while he napped, which meant I was just exhausted also for I'm still like 3 years.
How old are your boys right now? How old are they?
3.5 and 1.5.
3.5 and 1.5.
Yeah, I just lost my mind.
That's impressive.
No, it's awful. It's awful. I think the thing that's, like, to be completely honest, it just means you're failing in one direction or the other at any given time. Like, I remember Ronan went through a really picky phase, and I was like, yeah, I could try to fix this. I could try to, like, research how the hell you get a toddler to eat any food whatsoever. Or I could, like, do research for my career, and I probably still won't have enough time for that. So you're all just sort of choosing which thing you're going to be messing up or which ball will be dropping. Which everyone here knows who has come here and like had to sneak out of the house because it's bedtime and kids are trying to fall asleep.
I'll be right back.
Yeah, 2 hours. But then on the other side, I really like descriptions of motherhood when I find them in books, and I wanted to write about it. And I think it's still something that people feel kind of hesitant writing about. Like, there's this idea that motherhood is kind of private or it's boring. I've been reading a lot of poetry recently, and there are women who were talking about how there's like love poetry, and there's war poetry, and there's nature poetry, and there's not like maternal poetry. You don't see a lot of births told from the perspective of the person having the birth, because there's a sense that that's like,
we're effing busy, Flynn.
Yeah, we're busy. We're too busy. We're too busy.
Yeah, no, I'm just kidding.
Just write a poem during the C-section. Yeah, but then I love that. I feel very, very, very nosy about other people's experience. And so I really like when I see it in fiction too.
I thought this might be, Sam, can I open it up to questions, or where did Sam go?
Sam's gone. Sam just walked out.
He's selling books.
He's selling books.
He's right there.
Well, actually, I'm just going to open it up to questions because
Yeah.
I'm a teacher, so that's what I do. Does anyone have a question for Flynn about writing as a mother, or maybe some of you are interested in writing a book yourselves? And we are both sort of, I would say, writers in the. People keep calling me a mid-career writer, and I'm like, F you, I don't think
Early.
so. Yeah,
Early days.
Yeah. Any questions for the author? Oh, okay. Yes. Hi.
I'm curious about whether or not you've taken sides on the conflict in Northern Ireland.
That's such a good question. I think about that all the time because I think the fear in writing about a group like the IRA is that you don't want to romanticize it and you don't want to act like it was something different than it was. But on the other hand, they were trying to end colonialism, or are trying, and that's, in my mind, a noble goal. So it's very messy. I felt like while I was doing research, my allegiance would shift depending on who I was talking to. So I interviewed a detective who was talking about how he has to check under his car, currently in Belfast, has to check under his car for an explosive device every morning. He has to tell his kids to be careful about opening the door because he's a target. And he was talking about how a lot of the people he's going after in the IRA are basically, like, not drug dealers, but they're basically like a mafia. Like, they're getting protection money from restaurants, they're taking cuts from drug dealers, and they're doing a lot of like intimidation in the community and policing in the community. So when I was talking to him, I was thinking, oh, this is very reasonable, and I see your point. But then it's hard. And then I talked to a former IRA member, and if you hear about how someone gets radicalized slowly over time, it makes sense. Like, the IRA in some ways is sort of like the Norwich listserv. Like, it's like a group of people working together in the absence of, like, maybe the police or other structures, and being kind to one another. So the way people get radicalized oftentimes isn't a dramatic sort of shift, but it's you have someone coming around and offering to, like, help paint your house, or asking if you need a cup of tea after someone's died, or helping out when you have a problem and you're getting evicted. And then that slowly ramps up, and those are the people you're trusting. And then they say, can you pass a message to my friend? Can we store some things at your house? And suddenly you have a weapons drop in your farm or under your cellar. So it's hard. I mean, I think Ireland should be united. I don't think it should be a colony in Belfast still.
And they're all family, right?
Yeah, everyone's related. Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's the single biggest indicator of if you'll join is if your family has been involved more than anything else. Which makes sense.
That actually sounds a little nicer than the Norwich listserv.
Yeah, vicious. Yeah, the vicious, savage Norwich listserv. Yeah.
But I have to say, I get your understanding with Northern Ireland, because I didn't know that much about it, other than it was sort of a myth in our family, because my great uncle was, like, spirited out of Ireland under, IRA circumstances. That's sort of what they say. But when you go there and you see the peace, well, you can't believe your eyes. It's like, am I in Palestine? Or am I in Israel? Am I in Bosnia? I mean, where am I? Because it's right there in Northern Ireland. They separate the communities, and you have to go through, like, checkpoint Charlie to get from one neighborhood to the next. So that's when you really understand this is crazy. And I have to say, I didn't know it was in the future. I'm sorry to say that, but I listen to all my books, and so sometimes I miss, like, critical pieces. But having gone to the Troubles Museum and the Ulster Museum, they had that. So I was just throwing myself back into that era, or a little, not in the 70s, but maybe like the 90s, or I don't know. But I was not in the future in that book. But it was probably, I just missed a cue. But I totally get your fascination with that conflict, because it's the people that you don't think are going to be in those conflicts, and there they are. It's just Protestant against Catholic, and it's crazy.
Yeah, and they're also, I mean, they're like this, someone described it as like the two different flavors of the same religion. Yeah. So it sort of shows how ridiculous these kinds of zero-sum conflicts can be, and how absurd they can get. Like, Protestants and Catholics have all these sort of codes for how they can tell what community someone else is from. One is how you pronounce the letter H. It's absurd. Like, you're dialing down to such small differences between the two communities. Also, the peace walls are still up, and there are also these huge murals on the sides of buildings of masked men carrying rifles with slogans that are like, "Prepared for peace, ready for war." Yeah. Still, and they haven't been painted over, and there are hundreds of them, which is sort of like a tourism draw partly, but it's also just a very odd thing to have on your like gable wall of your house.
Yeah. And I think it shakes down too. I mean, we have a lot of, so many of us are descendants of Ireland, either on either side, and we do have, there is a divide here amongst just culturally, I think, Protestant and my friends that are Catholic, I'm like, yeah, you're Catholic. You're guilty about everything. And it's very, I think it's something we can relate to. Yeah, it's really interesting. Yes.
I have a question. Forgive me, because it's been, I think, over a year since I read the book. But Tessa is the protagonist.
Yeah.
So she's meeting with a detective regularly to, connect with her sister, and you feel the heat of their relationship. And I was always curious, was that just like her caught up in the romance of the situation, or is it actually two-sided? Because nothing ever comes to fruition, and he ghosts her. But just on your thoughts, Flynn.
Yeah.
To get to the bottom of it.
So I'm working on another book that's told from the sister's point of view. I'm getting more into that sort of relationship. I think what I found really interesting in researching it was that the way MI5 and the police operate when they have undercover agents is that they're trying to build up a really intimate relationship and make the person feel really beloved and respected and heard. And so at a certain point, you have this person who's running you, who's your handler, who knows more about you in your current moment than anyone else in your life, because they're the person who's giving you your tasks and hearing your secrets. And also they're the person who's going to save you if you get caught. They're like, your entire life is in this one other human's hands. And the way that they recruit is similar to how the IRA radicalizes, where it's often with a lot of like kindness and a lot of sort of solicitousness and like, oh, how is it going with your mom's illness or something really small like that. So that seems like a really messy relationship that I was curious about. I think I probably also wrote like a 20-page sex scene and then deleted it, because you can't ever actually publish that, because it's horrible always. When you write, you're like, this is wonderful, very accurate, very compelling, very hot, and then you read it back over and you're like, no, that will never, ever make it in. I think most books you read probably have that cut from somewhere in it.
And then white space.
Yeah, exactly. Just page break. Just page break to the next scene.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Hello. Yeah.
Flynn, can you talk a little bit about your relationship with your editor?
Oh, it's wonderful. Thank you for asking. No one ever asks about editors. They're like the absolute unsung
Is this
heroes.
your editor?
This is my editor. Bruce. He's here.
A couple decades ago, I wrote a book, so I know about editors. Curious how you work with an editor, given that there were some deleted scenes, shall we say.
Oh yeah, I think that was before it got to her. She's great. So she's been my editor since my first book, and she was kind of a young editor. We've kind of grown up together in a very nice way. And she's my first reader along with my agent. She's great. I think it's always, you get the manuscript back with all the markup. I wonder if it's like this for you too. And you read all the markup and the like huge amount of work that the editor wants you to do, and you think like, this is impossible and I hate them. And then you sort of put it away, and then you look at it again and you think, oh, actually this is all completely valid, and you work through it. Katie and I are in a writing group together, and I think what we both have, which other people maybe don't, who haven't gone through an MFA, is like a very thick skin. Because if you've gone through a workshop, like you just get destroyed over and over and over again. And so there comes a point where there's no kind of personal attachment to an edit.
Yeah. No.
You
Okay,
just cut
it's
it.
fine.
Yeah, fine.
Oh, you didn't
We'll
like
cut
that? I'll think about it. Yeah.
You can change it.
Yeah.
No, she's great.
But how hard do you listen to those kind of critiques in workshops? Because after a while, I mean, you realize like everybody has their own opinion. So are you going to listen to them? I mean, when you just start to say, this is what I like and this is where I'm going to go with it. So, sorry.
Yeah. I think you have to find whoever is aiming in the same direction you are for your project. For everyone.
Yeah,
right?
and information, like things like, I didn't understand how my character got from the truck to the diner. Like, because sometimes we have stories in our heads and we just forget to fill it.
So you're talking about
it's almost like you're,
like that kind of
yeah,
thing,
you're at dinner with a friend and you're telling a
Right.
story and they're like, wait, how did you meet that guy?
Okay, that's good.
Yeah.
It's exactly like that. But things like tone, I think, and theme, and I just didn't like especially when it gets into like, I didn't like this character. You're like, well, this character's not likable. That's what makes fiction so fun. We're not writing memoirs,
right?
We're writing about, kind of sometimes awful people, and that's why fiction is what it is, so we can be in the imagination and explore. Yeah. So I actually love it when I hate. What did I recently get some feedback, and it was the characters are very much like myself. And this editor said, God, I hated her, and why is she in this marriage? And I was like, well, she's having a really hard time right now, and she has children, and, I don't know.
You don't know what she's going through. Yeah, that's hard. Yeah, I've done that too. I think also with women characters, you get unlikable as a comment just all the time.
Yeah.
If it's not like Bridget Jones, if it's not like a comedic heroine that everyone can root for and get behind.
Yeah.
People are like, so is she a murderer? Who is she?
Why
You're
is
like,
she
"Why?"
so mean to
Yeah.
her children? Yeah. We'll stop there. Sam, any fielding questions?
You have other questions? Go.
Hi.
I have a question. It's about how you incorporate your research and then also like just the everyday observations and feelings. I remember there's this part where she has her baby in a carrier and his little feet are like cucumbers.
Oh.
And it was just so perfect because anyone who's ever carried a baby like that knows exactly what that feeling is. And I could just like feel that. I was like, yeah. Or like when she was swimming, what the water felt like. But then there's also all these things I have no direct experience of whatsoever, but they were also woven together. So do you just like write things down all the time? Or how do you? And then once you have your things you know and the things you've learned, how do you weave them together?
Yeah, I'm so glad you like the baby carrier. I do feel like anyone who has had that, is an integral part of your memory forever. It's really hard. It's also really hard with this kind of research because there's so much I found that I wanted to stick in somehow and couldn't. I think I actually did get this in, but one thing I learned was that the IRA was fundraising by renting out hot tubs for parties and bouncy castles for children's birthday parties. And that kind of fact, that fact I managed to like shoehorn an entire conversation around so that I could get it in. But there's lots of other information that I couldn't fit. Like I also learned, should I get this in? A lot of IRA members' girlfriends have tanning salons because it's a cash business, so you can launder the money that way. So if you drive down the Falls Road, it's like tanning beds, nail salons, tanning bed, nail salons, and you just think these people are very interested in grooming, but it's like a complete money laundering operation. It's hard. I write by hand, as is Katie, and it seems like you just sort of end up with thousands of pages handwritten, and then you have to just cut viciously. And the editor is good too. I think I could have, because I had a baby at the time too, I could have just written descriptions of what babies look like while they're nursing, like 20 pages, but that gets boring. There's only a certain number of times you can describe like what their eyes do while they're nursing, and then you have to kind of limit it. And that's why editors are good, because they say, you did mention the eyes moving while nursing 20 pages ago, so maybe cut that. It's fine.
Really part of my life right now.
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now while I'm
But I
doing
like
this.
how you sprinkled it in. As you said, it was about being a mother and like how you even like had to kneel down to like button his coat or whatever.
Yeah.
It's like, oh my gosh, that's really it.
Yeah.
So it was nice to have that throughout.
Yeah. I know, it's funny, Jeff and my husband, I say as though all of you know him, we were watching the latest Bond movie, and at one point he was like, oh, this is just a fantasy about not having kids. It's like you just wear like white clothes and you run around and you drink cocktails and like you have adventures and nobody's like picking up all the toys after bedtime and throwing them in the bin, which is like 75% of parenting is just sort of the like tidying, it feels like. And so I wanted to write about that because I like seeing it. I think it's left out too much.
Yeah, it is.
The kind of chores,
It
like
totally is.
not parenting necessarily, but the chores of parenting and the kind of physical work.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, you're right about it too.
Throwing the toys in the bin.
Throwing the toys in the
Or
bin.
not,
Yeah.
because
Hour.
you just have to do it again tomorrow.
Yeah, I know. Sometimes it's like, why even?
Yep.
Why not just lie back and have a cocktail and let it all go to hell? That's when the professionals come in.
For you or for the house?
Yeah.
That's the question.
Yeah.
Person
Yep.
shows
Everyone's
up.
asking.
Three people do both.
Well, on that note, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Flynn Berry, Katie Crouch. The new novel in paperback, today is Northern Spy. We've got copies around the corner in the front room. We've got a couple of copies of Embassy White left, Katie Crouch's novel.
Paperback
Pick 'em
will be
up.
out in July.
There
Sam.
will be a paperback out in July.
Yeah.
Yes, it's true. We'll be shouting that from the rooftops too. Pick up books. We'll be happy to sign back here. If you have other questions you're thinking of, you can ask them in person up at the front. Thank you all for being here tonight.
you.
We really appreciate it. And if you want to help us out and you want to fold up your chair and just set it against anything that will move, we will appreciate it. And if not, we'll get to it.
And Sam, was this the first post-pandemic?
Well, it was the second. But you're in
Oh.
here.
But here we are, so we're on the other side of it. So how about a
Yeah.
hand for that? All right.
Thanks for being part of our community.
Thank you, Sam.